Well, it's good to be back from our staycation. We spent a wonderful week with our children and grandchildren, all at home. And fortunately, our daughter just lives 3 doors down from us, so we were able to spend a week sharing guests between the two houses. And our daughter has a new swimming pool, so we all had a lot of fun staying at home. But everybody's gone home now, and I thank you all for your patience and your putting up with the fact that I did not have a Sunday school lesson last week. So we're trying to pick up where we left off. If you'll recall, 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the satisfaction theory of the atonement that was put forth by Saint Anselm in the 11th century. Today, we're going to pick up on that. We want to talk a little bit about some of the objections to the satisfaction theory and look at the moral influence or the moral example theory that was promulgated by Peter Abelard in response to the satisfaction theory. As we see, almost all of these theories are put forth as a response to something that people see as unacceptable in a previous theory. And usually the thing that they see as unacceptable is a misunderstanding of the other theory. As I have studied each of these theories, what I have found is that each one of them contains truth. The ransom theory contains truth. The Christus Victor or the recapitulation model contains truth. The satisfaction model contains truth. And as we'll see today, I believe the moral influence theory contains truth. I think that each one of them also has some ways that it can be misunderstood if you take the model too far. I think to pick up on and to anticipate where I'm going in the future, John Calvin talked a lot about the mystery of everything that we're talking about and how a lot of this simply can't be put into words. And so what we're doing is we're discussing humans' attempts to put into words what can't be put into words. And so sometimes it can seem like a futile exercise, but I still think it's important because I've said before, how we think about the atonement will have an impact on how we view God. And how we view God and how we view his sense of justice will have an impact on how we think about the atonement. And I know that as my own thoughts and feelings about some of these atonement models have changed over the decades, my own image of God has changed over the decades. And so that's sort of what's driving this whole study. So let's proceed. Let me get to where we need to be for today. We're down to slide number 51, and right now we're up to 85 slides total. That will continue to grow as we get into other models. All right, so let's just look at a quick review. It's been 2 weeks since I've last shared with you. So we first looked at what are called the classic views of the atonement or the Christus Victor view. Again, this is a 1931 label put on a view that dates back to the 2nd century. And is promulgated by Irenaeus. And the Christus Victor view is still held today by the Eastern Orthodox Church. It was held for about the first 1,000 years of Christianity. And under this theory or this model, Adam's sin resulted in a bondage of human beings to Satan, to evil, and to death. Jesus came along, he summed up humanity or recapitulated humanity in himself. And so he succeeded where Adam failed. Where Adam failed in righteousness, Jesus succeeded in righteousness. His incarnation, his death, his resurrection, all served to defeat evil and death. And this is something I think is kind of important to note, is that in these older models, the focus wasn't just on the cross. They looked at the totality of the life of Christ, and it was his incarnation. And they focused more on the incarnation than I think they did even on the crucifixion. Even Athanasius wrote a book on the incarnation. And so this is all about the incarnation, God becoming man. And it was just that fact in and of itself that served to reconcile humanity to God. Of course, the crucifixion is an integral part of that, but it was the totality of Christ's life, the totality from birth, incarnation, his whole life, his life of sinless obedience to his Father, all of which served to sum up humanity. And so, that was that atonement theory. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see that I've got a bullet point there saying the Father and the Son worked together to defeat evil. And this is something that I think is important about the classic Christus Victor model of the atonement. This is God the Father and God the Son working together for a common purpose. And they work together to defeat evil, to defeat Satan. Now, what muddies this whole thing up is the ransom component that got thrown in there. And several early church fathers focused in on the ransom component, in which they were saying that Jesus paid a ransom to Satan. And of course, that just boggles the mind to think about. But many of them held strongly to that. And it was that component of this classic view that St. Anselm objected to. And he reacted to that. And he says, no. Jesus isn't paying a ransom to Satan. Nobody owes Satan anything. And God doesn't negotiate with terrorists, to put a 21st century spin on it. And so St. Anselm said, look, if mankind owes anything to anybody, it's not to Satan, it's to God himself. And so Anselm came up with what is now called the satisfaction model of the atonement. And in this model, Adam's sin dishonored God. As a result, Adam became indebted to God to repay this lost honor. But the problem with this, as Anselm put it, if all Adam did was simply pay a debt, that would not restore God's honor. Adam had to do more than just simply repay a debt. He had to make this payment out of love and not as an obligation of debt. And that's something that Adam couldn't do. He simply couldn't do that. When I talk about Adam, I'm talking about mankind in general. And so as Anselm put it, only a sinless person could satisfy God's honor by voluntarily dying. And it was so important to Anselm that Jesus' death was a voluntary act on his part. He went so far on this that he said that when Jesus went to the cross, that by itself was not an act in obedience to God, because God never would have commanded Jesus to go to the cross. God the Father. That God the Father needed Jesus to go to the cross on his own accord, not as in response to a command of the Father. So Jesus voluntarily went to the cross. And that was important, and according to Anselm, that was critical to satisfying God's honor. Now, this atonement model, this is really the first time that we have an atonement model that's couched in legal terms, in terms of a law court analogy. This is a legal transaction. It's analogous to civil justice, where, say, I get into a car accident with you. The accident's my fault, and I end up owing you $50,000 for your injuries. I don't have $50,000 laying around, so my insurance company comes in and pays that debt on my behalf. It's that type of a legal transaction. And in this case, the Son of God worked to satisfy the Father. And this presented the germ of some of the objections to the satisfaction model, and that is there is an opposition, if you will, between Father and Son. The Son is seeking to satisfy an angry Father. And so the objections to the satisfaction model focused in on God's honor. Anselm made a major point of the fact that God was dishonored by Adam's sin. And as a result, Jesus had to satisfy God's honor. And those who object to the satisfaction model do so, they say that this focus on God's honor is misplaced, that God isn't really concerned about his honor. They feel that God was depicted as self-absorbed, easily offended, and even angry, that his honor was offended. And so now he needs to be satisfied. And if you put that all in extreme human terms, it can come across as not a very pretty picture of God. Well, Anselm himself had an answer to this. He said that yes, from the standpoint of Adam, he sinned and he dishonored God. But he said that on an emotional basis or on an emotional level, God wasn't dishonored. He wasn't offended. You can't offend God. I mean, God is perfect love, and you can't offend perfect love in that sense. So he was saying that the honor wasn't so much an emotional dishonoring of God. The sin wasn't an emotional dishonoring of God. It was just simply, it was a legal dishonor. It was a dishonor that says that I'm disobeying you, I am dishonoring you, but it's not that God was offended. Anselm made that clear in his book. And yet, people who react against the satisfaction theory over and over say the same thing, that it portrays God as easily offended and even angry at being dishonored. And I think part of that is because of the language that Anselm used in his book. He kept talking over and over again about being dishonored, and having satisfaction restored. And as we think of those words in the 21st century, we think, yes, this sounds like a person who's easily offended. And yet Anselm himself in his book anticipated that response. He addressed it, although I think his attempt to address it has fallen on deaf ears to some extent. N.T. Wright has a book out, if you can see it, The Day the Revolution Began. Here, let me get this bigger so you can see it. The Day the Revolution Began, N.T. Wright. And this is his book dealing with the atonement. I'm sorry, I'm distracted as I'm playing around with my computer screen. I should probably just leave things well enough alone. This is N.T. Wright's book about the cross, about the atonement. He talks about a lot of these atonement theories in the book. And he makes this comment. He talks about how important it is to read each one of these theories within the historical context in which they came about. And he says this: the idea that someone's honor needed to be satisfied made the sense it did within the complex codes of behavior in the High Middle Ages. Keep in mind, Anselm is putting this all together when we have knights and we have jousts and we have people fighting and dying for honor. We have duels taking place and people killing each other for the sake of honor. And it was within that system, even the feudal system of Europe, in which you had lords and castles and vassals and serfs and the whole feudal system going on, honor was a very important part of that system. And so sometimes people will indicate that Anselm was just simply reflecting the moral code of his day. And to some extent, I think that's very true. Another objection to the satisfaction theory is its emphasis on the payment of debts. In Anselm's theory, everybody owes somebody something. He says that Adam was created indebted to God, and the debt was a debt of obedience. The moment Adam was created, he owed God a debt of obedience. Jesus pays that debt on behalf of Adam, and then Anselm says that God immediately becomes indebted to Jesus. The Father becomes indebted to Jesus. Again, we see this opposition going on, this relationship, somewhat adversarial relationship now, where now the Father is owing something to the Son, and Jesus is saying, I don't need anything. So take what you owe me, Father, and give it to the rest of humanity. And that's where the forgiveness of sins comes in, at least according to Anselm. But there are those out there who point out what I think is a very serious concern. I'll use that word, concern, with satisfaction theory. And that is Anselm talking about satisfaction of debts or forgiveness of debts? And this is something I'm going to come back to later when we talk about the penal substitution theory, the atonement, because I think the same objection applies there. If we say that man sinned, and as a result of man's sin, man owes something to God, at this point, God has two options. He can either forgive that debt, or he can demand that that debt be paid. And those two options are somewhat mutually exclusive. If you forgive a debt, that means you're not requiring the debt to be paid. If, however, you require the debt to be paid, then there's nothing left to forgive. Now, what Anselm is saying is that Jesus fully paid our debt. And so because Jesus fully paid our debt, God forgives the debt. But what the opponents to that theory say is, no. If Jesus paid the debt, then there is no debt to forgive. And this creates quite a controversy that people debate even to this day. If the debt is fully paid, then there's nothing to forgive. If you look throughout the Bible, forgiveness is a very, very strong theme from Old Testament to New Testament. In Deuteronomy, we have the year of Jubilee set up, where every 7 years the Jews were supposed to cancel all the debts, cancel the debts. This doesn't mean they're paid. This means they're canceled. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus is always talking about forgiveness. And he's commanding us to forgive debts, forgive trespasses, forgive wrongs done, meaning that we do not require payment. We do not require satisfaction. And yet God is depicted as requiring satisfaction. George MacDonald pointed out that this makes human beings more merciful than God, because Jesus commands us to give mercy in a situation where Anselm is saying God would not give mercy. And so there's this contradiction going on here. Is God forgiving sins, or is he demanding satisfaction for sins? And those who raise this concern say you can't do both. You can't require payment and then say you're forgiving it. If the sin is paid for, then it's paid for. If I owe you $50,000 and my insurance company pays you $50,000, then you can't say that you're forgiving me the rest of the debt, because there is no debt to pay. I have satisfied the debt. I owe you nothing, and there's nothing for you to forgive. And so that's I think is a very serious objection that we need to look into. Again, I'll have more to say on that next week or the week after, depending on when we get to it. Behind this whole idea of satisfying a debt is one of the objections is that Anselm is reflecting the Catholic notion of penitence. Keep in mind, St. Anselm is part of the Roman Catholic Church, the Western part of the Catholic Church. He's coming up with this theory right about the same time as the Great Schism that took place between the Western Church and what became the Eastern Church. And so now the Western Church is becoming Roman Catholic. Well, even before Anselm's time, the Catholics had this notion of penitence, that when you go and confess your sins to the priest, he will require you to perform some act of repentance, some act of penitence, to essentially appease God. I'm not a Catholic, so those of you who are, you can explain this to me better than I can to you. I've never been Catholic. I don't know that many Catholics, but during the confession process, the priest will require you to do some act of penitence, and obviously Protestants generally react against that or object against that notion of having to do an act of penitence. Well, there are those who will say that Anselm was drawing on that notion of an act of penitence to satisfy an angry God as part of his atonement theory. And as a result, the act of penitence, and because of the atonement theory in which Jesus is satisfying an offended God, then the whole penitence thing perpetuated throughout the Catholic faith. Okay, so let's move on. There was one gentleman in particular, and my clicker has died, so we'll do, oh, I'm not, there we go. One man in particular who objected to Anselm's satisfaction theory was a man by the name of Peter Abelard. And you can see by the dates he lived 50 years or so after Anselm. And he came up, or he resurrected, I would say, a model of the atonement known as the moral influence or the moral example model. When I say he resurrected it, this is not new to Peter Abelard. It was, there were early church fathers, and I've got a couple quotes here that I'll share with you in a second. A couple early church fathers who wrote commentaries that seemed to adopt the moral influence theory of the atonement. Keep in mind, as I said before, all of these labels that we're using, moral theory, recapitulation, Christus Victor, these are labels that modern scholars have put on what the early church fathers and other fathers throughout the church history have written. None of the early church fathers said, hey, I'm going to sit down and give you an atonement theory. No, they just wrote different things about the life and crucifixion of Jesus, and it's the scholars later who are trying to classify these guys. And so what you'll find, as I've shared before, is that you'll find quotes, for example, from St. Augustine in favor of the moral influence theory, quotes from St. Augustine in support of the ransom theory, quote from St. Augustine in support of the penal substitution theory. And so what happens is, no matter what theory you like, you can find a quote somewhere in the early church fathers. So when I talk about a theory being predominant over the course of time or for the first 1,000 years, this is based on what other scholars have said about the predominant view as it's reflected in all the writings of the first 1,000 years, obviously, which I have not read. I've read snippets here and there, but certainly not the extent to people who are much smarter than I am. So Peter Abelard, he resurrects the moral influence theory. He doesn't like the image of God that St. Anselm has presented. He doesn't like the idea of a God who needs to be satisfied, whose honor is offended and needs to be satisfied. So he reverts back to a moral influence example theory. And in this theory, Jesus died to influence human beings to live righteous lives. We are influenced by the supreme example of God's love for us. And let me explain a little bit the distinction between moral influence and moral example. If we're looking at this theory as a moral influence theory, basically what we're saying is that God's love so influences us, it motivates us to take loving action. As a moral example theory is God's or Jesus' death provides an example to us of how we should die to our own selves to love other people. So it's both moral influence and moral example, but the two are slightly different. This is a good summary from Angel Manuel Rodriguez, of an article that he wrote, The Moral Influence View, from the Bible Research Institute. I found it online as I'm doing my research. He says, first, the cross is understood to be the supreme revelation of God's love. There, God identified himself with us to the point of going through what we all experience, namely death. Second, the manifestation of God's love was so full that as a result, we are transformed by it. That is called the moral influence of the cross. The voluntary death of Christ on the cross awakens in us love toward God. It changes our attitude toward him and moves us to exemplify his love in our lives. That's a great summary of the moral influence theory of the atonement. As I said before, other church fathers said some similar things. Clement of Alexandria, back in 150 to 215, that was his lifespan. He said this, For he came down, for this he assumed human nature, for this he willingly endured the sufferings of humanity, that by being reduced to the measure of our weakness, he might raise us to the measure of his power. And just before he poured out his offering, when he gave himself as a ransom, he left us a New Testament, quote, I give you my love. What is the nature and extent of this love? For each of us, he laid down his life, the life which was worth the whole universe, and he requires in return that we should do the same for each other. So here in this one quote, we see a lot of different things. About midway through, it says he gave himself as a ransom. So there's that language that gets quoted by ransom theorists who say that Clement of Alexandria supported the ransom theory. He gave us a New Testament. I give you my love. As we can see here in the moral influence model of the atonement, the focus is on God's love, not God's need to be satisfied, not on the fact that God is offended by our sin, but his love for us. He needs to bring us into a relationship with him so that we can now, we can emulate his love by giving ourselves for other people. So he gives us the example to motivate us. The whole idea behind the influence model is that we see Jesus' love and we are completely motivated to then repent, return to him, and to show that love toward other people. Peter Abelard, in one of his writings, put it this way: love is increased by the faith which we have concerning Christ, because on account of the belief that God in Christ has united our human nature to himself, and by suffering in that same nature has demonstrated to us that supreme love of which Christ himself speaks. Greater love has no one than this. We are thus joined through his grace to him and our neighbor by an unbreakable bond of love. Therefore, our redemption through the suffering of Christ is that deeper love within us, which not only frees us from slavery to sin, but also secures for us the true liberty of the children of God, in order that we might do all things out of love rather than out of fear. As Peter saw it, the satisfaction theory of St. Anselm generated in humanity a sense of a fear of this God who is easily angered, who is easily offended. And so we would act out of fear that this angry God is going to pour out his anger upon us. And it was important to Peter Abelard that we learn to do things out of love rather than out of fear. And the way we do that is seeing how Jesus did that on our behalf. He showed us his love, and as a result, we now love in response. Before I go on, I want to say just a sidelight here. Peter Abelard was an amazing guy, or a very interesting fellow, I should say. As we look through all these different examples of different people, you have to take the good with the bad. You have to understand that people who often theorize about God, often talk about God, don't necessarily always live the most godly lives. This, however, doesn't necessarily mean that what they're saying is wrong. We talked about this almost a year ago now, as we were sharing about some of the life of Saint Augustine. He had an interesting life. Well, Peter Abelard did as well. Abelard began his professional career in philosophy. He was a philosophy professor. And wherever he went, whatever school he was teaching at, wherever he went, he pretty much made enemies. People didn't like Peter Abelard, at least from what I've been able to gather. He seemed to come across as somebody who knew everything and knew he knew everything. And what made things worse is he did know everything. He was a very intelligent man. He liked to let everybody know it, and they objected to that. And like I say, everywhere he went, he made enemies. One of his the biggest chapters of his life was his love affair with a lady by the name of Eloise. I believe he had a child by Eloise, but I don't believe they were ever married. And all this is going on at the same time. So Peter's an interesting guy. Again, I don't want to negate anything that he has to say about godly truth by the fact that maybe his life wasn't necessarily a life that we want to emulate. But I think it's important to share that. A lot of scriptures that give support for the idea of Jesus' death being a moral influence. Greater love has no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends. For the love of Christ constrains us, because we judge this, that one died for all, therefore all died. We'll come back to that verse in a couple weeks. But God commends his own love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And then we love him because he first loved us. Obviously, the New Testament is all about God's love. Obviously, the New Testament is all about Christ's death being an expression of God's love. Keeping in mind that Jesus is part of that Godhead Trinity. When we talk about Jesus, let me back up. I always get frustrated when we talk about Jesus and God as if they're two separate beings. And of course, they're not. Usually what happens is when we talk about God, we mean the Father. And we talk about Jesus, we mean the Son. And both of which, along with the Holy Spirit, comprise the Godhead. 1 Peter 2:20 and 21. For what glory is it if, when you sin, you patiently endure beating? But if, when you do well, you patiently endure suffering, this is commendable with God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. I mean, this is a very clear statement that Christ's death is an example to us, a moral example to us. He's talking about suffering for doing well, and that's precisely what happened in the case of Jesus. He did well, and he died because he did well. In fact, that's what St. Anselm said, that he died because he lived a perfect life, and the people at the time were envious of that, and they were jealous of that, and they put him to death because of his perfect life. And so what Peter is saying is, look, if you do well and you suffer, that's commendable, because now you are doing what Jesus did. And Jesus suffered to leave you an example. Luke 9, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake, the same will find it. And again, we see here Jesus telling us to follow the example that he lives, to the point of death. Jesus answered them, the time has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Most certainly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains by itself alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. He who loves his life will lose it. He who hates his life in this world will keep it to eternal life. If anyone serves me, let him follow me. Where I am, there will my servant also be. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. Here again, Jesus is giving his own life, his own death as an example of how we should look at our own lives. When he's talking about the grain of wheat falling into the earth and dying, he's talking about himself. If he dies and he's buried in the earth, he's going to bear much fruit. In the same way, we need to die to ourselves, die to any ruling power in us other than the will of God. And this is something that we need to do. And as we do it, we will serve him and God will honor us. And he goes on, for I've given you an example. Here he's talking about the example of washing the disciples' feet, but Jesus' whole life was an example to us, that you also should do as I have done to you. Most certainly I tell you, a servant is not greater than his Lord, neither is one who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. And then finally, Paul says it quite plainly, be imitators of me, even as I also am of Christ. So in the scriptures, we have plenty of examples where Jesus' life is given as an example for us to live, including his own crucifixion. George MacDonald put it this way, I believe that he died that I might die like him, die to any ruling power in me but the will of God. live ready to be nailed to the cross if he will it. And then in another novel entitled Lilith, he wrote, you will be dead so long as you refuse to die. George was very, very strong in the thought of dying to self. For him, dying to self was a critical part of our salvation, that it wasn't just that we say the magic prayer and get a ticket to heaven after we die, but rather that we die to ourselves that we might live for Christ. And that was a very important part of George's teaching, and he saw Christ's death as an example to us. I don't put this quote up here to indicate that George MacDonald adhered to the moral influence theory of the atonement. As I've said before, George never really put forth a very clear exposition of his view of the atonement. He believed a lot of different things. He took from here, took from there, and put it all together. It was much easier for him, quite honestly, to say what he didn't believe about the atonement than it was for him to say what he did believe about it. And that's probably true for many of us. As we have so many theories floating around, it's very easy for us to say, hey, I don't like this, I don't like that, but it's a lot harder to put a positive expression on what do I actually believe here. Objections to the moral influence. One objection is that Jesus still has to die a tortured death to achieve the purposes. And this, one of the objections to satisfaction or even recapitulation is that Jesus is dying a death of torture. It's a horrible death that he died. And it was a horrible way that he was put to death. He was ramrodded through a kangaroo court and put to death, beaten, and it was just a horrible, horrible way to die. And the moral influence theory, for all of its talk about God's love, doesn't do away with the fact that Jesus still died a tortured death. The main objection is it's true as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. Some point out that it deals with sin subjectively. It deals with the effect of sin on humans, but not objectively the effect of sin on God. The objective side of the atonement is that Christ's death and resurrection had an objective effect in reconciling human beings to God. And the moral influence theory, at least on the surface, doesn't seem to address that directly. It deals with the subjective side of sin, the fact that it makes us immoral people, and now we need to become more moral. It provides for no objective satisfaction of anything that God may require of us. And in later centuries, it was over-liberalized. And what I mean by that is many people took the moral influence theory, people who reject the divinity of Christ, for example, or who deny the eternal existence of Jesus Christ. They all flocked to the moral influence because basically the moral influence theory is one that you can put forth without even dealing with Christ's death as such. So it's an easy theory to butcher. And over the centuries, it has been butchered by a lot of different sects and groups of people. So, okay, the moral influence, again, it was propounded or resurrected by Peter Abelard in an attempt to address what he saw was unsatisfactory about St. Anselm's theory. And as a result, it emphasizes the love of God, how Jesus' death is an example of how far God's love goes. All of that is true. All of that is easily explained in the Bible or addressed by the Bible. But I think the one objection that it doesn't go far enough, it doesn't explain enough, I think that's a valid objection. So next week we'll start looking at the penal substitution theory of the atonement. I've saved it for last in part because its broad acceptance was later than all of the other ones, and because it's probably the most controversial. We're going to have a lot of fun talking about this. There's a lot of strong feelings both for and against it. And it seems to be the target of a lot of what has been written about Jesus' death. So come back next week. We'll start our discussion about the penal substitution theory of the atonement. Have a great weekend, and God bless you all.